On the morning of March 22, 1977, a 44-year-old woman named Ruth Morgan rushed around her kitchen in the American city of Tucson, Arizona, like she did almost every day. Ruth was making sure her 4 daughters had everything they needed for school. As she did this, her girls all sat at the kitchen table eating their cereal, and their father, Ruth's husband, 39-year-old Chuck Morgan, sipped his coffee nearby. Ruth wished that Chuck would notice that she could really use some help right now getting the girls' stuff ready, but like he had been more and more recently, Chuck just seemed to be off in his own world. Annoyed, Ruth opened the fridge, took out 2 lunches packed in paper bags, and handed them to her younger daughters, and then she grabbed 2 backpacks that were lying on the floor nearby, and she handed them to her older girls. Then, a few minutes later, all 4 girls were hurrying out the door toward the car, with Ruth and Chuck following after them. As Chuck climbed into the driver's seat of their Mercury Cougar, Ruth, who was standing outside the car and would not be joining them, asked Chuck what time he'd be home from work. Chuck was going to drop the kids off and then go to his office. And for a second, Chuck didn't answer his wife. He just sat there looking totally exhausted. Chuck ran his own escrow company, which meant that his firm set up real estate deals between buyers and sellers to make sure the deals were conducted legally. And Tucson's real estate market was booming, so Chuck had been working a lot recently. Through the open car window, he turned and told Ruth that he was working on a huge deal, so he didn't really know what time he'd be back. Ruth wished Chuck did not have to work so much, but she also knew that nothing she said could stop him. As long as she'd known him, Chuck had been incredibly driven, to the point where sometimes Ruth worried about his health. He never took time off, and on the rare instances where he was not working, he didn't do things to relax, like watching TV or going and seeing his friends. Instead, it just seemed like Chuck bounced from one business deal or crisis to the next. And about once a year, he would push himself so hard with his work that he would basically have a nervous breakdown. At least that's what Ruth called it. And at that point, he would take a week off to recover, but that was it. The rest of the time, he basically worked 24/7. But Ruth also knew that Chuck's insane work ethic and drive was definitely paying off. It had already made their family much more financially successful than they ever imagined possible. Chuck and Ruth had grown up in very modest households, and so now to be able to give their girls a comfortable upbringing was quite satisfying for the parents. And so, on this typical Tuesday morning, Ruth did not push back on the possibility of Chuck needing to work late to finish this big deal. Instead, she just told him he looked great in his brown suit, she gave him a kiss, and watched as he turned on the car, pulled out of the driveway, and headed off in the direction of the girls' school. That afternoon, the girls came home from school on their own power, and Ruth sent them outside to play while she got dinner ready. She set a place at the table for the whole family, including Chuck, but when 6 o'clock rolled around and Chuck was still not home, Ruth and the girls decided to just eat without him. And when Ruth got the girls bathed and into their pajamas and tucked them into their beds, Chuck was still not home. But Ruth was not worried. This really was kind of typical for Chuck. Chuck's real estate clients were mostly rich businessmen who were buying up land all across the state, and they wanted a lot for their money. They were always calling Chuck away for meetings out of town without any warning, and sometimes Chuck would be gone at these meetings for a couple of days at a time without any notice. And at the time, in 1977, there were no cell phones, and most people, including Ruth and her family, didn't have answering machines. And so, when Ruth hadn't seen Chuck or heard from him, she just figured he must have tried calling the house earlier to let her know that he would indeed be out super late on this deal, but she just must have missed the call because she was out running errands, and so Chuck would just get back whenever he got back. So that night, Ruth went to bed alone, figuring that she would wake up and see Chuck in the morning, or at a minimum, she would get a call the next day from Chuck to figure out where he was, what he was doing, and when to expect him home. But the next day, Chuck did not come home, and he didn't call. And it was the same story the next day. But again, Ruth had seen this behavior from Chuck before. It was rare, but Chuck did sometimes just kind of vanish for days at a stretch on certain deals. And so, at 2 a.m. on March 25th, 3 days after Ruth last saw Chuck or heard from Chuck, it was when he drove off to drop the girls at school, Ruth lay awake in her and Chuck's upstairs bedroom, trying to now convince herself that Chuck was fine, that everything was okay, that this was totally normal. But she now knew that this was officially the longest stretch of time she had ever gone without hearing from Chuck. And deep down, she started to feel like something had to be wrong. But as she lay there stressing out about all sorts of what-if scenarios, she heard the family dog barking downstairs, and instantly, Ruth let out a sigh of relief. The dog must be barking because Chuck was walking in the door. He was home. So Ruth climbed out of bed, she walked into the hallway, flipped on the light, and began heading downstairs. And as she descended the steps, she called out to Chuck, but no one answered. When she got to the first floor, there was still no answer, and the dog was now starting to bark even louder. And suddenly the hairs on Ruth's arms stood up. If Chuck wasn't home, why was the dog barking? What was going on? She dashed across the living room into the kitchen, she turned on the light, and saw the family dog up on its hind legs, pawing at the back door and barking. Ruth very slowly crept toward that door and pulled back the curtain that covered a small window on it, and she looked outside. And what she saw took her breath away. It was Chuck. However, he was just standing there on the back step, not making any attempt to come in the house. And he had this crazed look on his face. And when he saw Ruth, he didn't react. He just stood there staring. Ruth had no idea what her husband was doing. She was just relieved that he was home. And so she reached down and fumbled with the lock. She opened the door and frantically told Chuck to come in and tell her what was going on. Where had he been? But once the door was open, Chuck kind of just staggered into the kitchen and literally fell into Ruth's arms. She dragged him across the room and put him in one of the kitchen chairs, and then once he was seated, Ruth finally got a good look at her husband and she nearly screamed. Chuck's eyes were totally bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days, and his wrists were bound with zip ties, and he had a plastic handcuff on one of his ankles. But what scared Ruth most of all was that Chuck still was just not speaking. She asked him again to tell her what was going on, but he just sat there silent, looking off into the distance. Ruth ran to a kitchen drawer and grabbed a knife, and then she rushed to Chuck and cut the ties around his wrists, and when Chuck's hands were free, he finally began to communicate with Ruth, but not with words, instead with hand gestures. He motioned towards a notepad and pen sitting on the counter nearby, and so Ruth, understanding what he was asking for, reached over and grabbed the pen and paper and handed them to Chuck. And as he wrote, Ruth, who was now kind of hovering over his shoulder, couldn't believe the words on the paper. When Chuck was done, Ruth ran to the phone and said they had to call 911 right now. But at this, Chuck banged on the table and shook his head at her to stop. Then, in huge letters on the pad, he told Ruth that if they called the cops, their whole family would be killed. Ruth moved away from the phone and started crying. Chuck began to stand up, and Ruth instinctively grabbed him and supported him on her shoulder, and then just walked him upstairs to their bedroom, where he lay down and fell asleep almost instantly. And after he was asleep, Ruth, not knowing what else to do, just did a quick check of the girls and was very relieved to see that none of them had woken up to the commotion of their father returning. Then Ruth headed back to her own bedroom and laid down next to Chuck, but she didn't shut her eyes. Instead, she lay awake trying to figure out what the heck just happened and what she was going to do about it. On the notepad, Chuck had written that he'd been kidnapped and tortured for 2 days before managing to escape, and that now his throat was coated with a hallucinogenic drug that made it impossible for him to talk and could maybe even kill him if he ingested it. It should be noted here that we don't really know if he meant the drug was painted inside of his throat or if it was painted on the outside of his neck. We just don't know. The whole thing just seemed totally insane, and so Ruth, as she lay there, started to wonder if maybe this was one of Chuck's annual nervous breakdowns from overworking. But if it was, then this was the most bizarre and extreme breakdown she had ever seen. It took almost a week for Chuck to recover from whatever had happened to him, and during that time, he only communicated with Ruth via notes on a notepad. Again, he was convinced there was a drug painted either on or in his throat that he had to avoid ingesting, and so not talking was his solution. At the beginning of this recovery week, Ruth asked Chuck lots of questions about where he had been and what had happened, but again, she got virtually no answers from him. And so pretty early on in that week, Ruth just began focusing on nursing her husband back to health, which included giving him water through an eyedropper because he had written that if he drank too much liquid at one time, this hallucinogenic drug coating his throat might activate and attack his nervous system. Finally, after that week of recovery was up and Chuck got out of bed and started talking again, Ruth now demanded answers about this whole crazy situation. But nothing Chuck said to her made any sense. Chuck told Ruth that owning his escrow business was not his only job. In addition to his escrow business, he was actually an undercover agent for the U.S. Treasury Department. The Treasury Department is a federal agency that investigates financial crimes. Chuck didn't say who had kidnapped him, but he said they knew he had information that could send them to prison for a long time. As Ruth listened to what her husband was saying, she simply didn't believe him. Instead, she thought this really had to be one of his big annual nervous breakdowns, and that eventually he would just snap out of this and be normal Chuck again. And so, when Chuck insisted that Ruth not tell anyone what he had told her about his real identity and the trouble he had now gotten into, Ruth didn't really care and said, "Fine, I won't tell anyone." But over the next couple of months, Chuck did not snap out of it. He did not become normal Chuck. Instead, his mental state seemed to get worse and worse. He started wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a .357 Magnum revolver, which is a very powerful pistol, whenever he left the house. He also bought a special belt that could conceal a knife in the buckle, and he grew a big thick beard to disguise his face. He was also convinced that someone had bugged their home phone, so he started to leave the house and go to payphones whenever he had to make calls. And whenever Ruth, who was now becoming very seriously concerned for her husband, asked him what was going on or what he was so scared of, he would just tell her the less she knew, the safer she'd be. On the morning of June 7th, so about 2.5 months after Chuck had stumbled in their back door insisting he had been kidnapped and drugged, Ruth wound up driving the girls to school that morning. When she left, Chuck told her he would be going to his office that day. After Ruth left, Chuck headed to a payphone near their house and called his staff, informing them that he would be there in about a half an hour. But he never showed up, and eventually someone from his staff called the police. Even though Ruth had done what her husband had asked and had not gone to police or told anyone about his strange behavior, she couldn't help but feel incredibly relieved when she heard that the Tucson police had put out a missing person alert for Chuck. However, when the police spoke to her, she opted to continue keeping Chuck's secret, mostly because she was worried if she told them what he told her, they would think he was crazy or dangerous. And so all she told police was that she was just very worried about him and hoped he would come home soon. 9 days later, on the night of June 16th, Chuck had still not been found, he was still missing, no one knew where he was, and this night, Ruth was home, she was sitting on the couch, staring at the television, but she wasn't really watching it. Her mind was wondering where the heck her husband was, and she couldn't help but think that something terrible had happened to him. And as she sat there staring blankly at the TV, the phone rang in the kitchen. And suddenly, Ruth felt a jolt of energy, thinking maybe it was Chuck. And so she ran to the kitchen, she answered the phone, but instead of hearing her husband's voice, she heard a woman's voice that she didn't recognize, and in a quiet voice, the strange woman said, "Ruthie, Chuck is all right. Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Then the woman hung up. Ruth just stood there for a second, holding the phone to her ear, listening to the dial tone. Now she was even more confused. Was this some sign that Chuck really was an undercover agent for the Treasury Department, and this woman maybe worked with him there, and maybe she was like his handler, and maybe she was now reaching out to Ruth with some code? I mean, Ruth had no idea, but at least now, Ruth had a clue about what happened to her husband. She had this Bible passage, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. So Ruth hung up the phone and ran to a bookshelf in the living room. She stretched up to reach the top shelf and she grabbed her family Bible, and then Ruth rushed with the Bible to the couch. She sat down and flipped through the pages until she got to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Ruth read the verses, but she didn't understand what they could possibly have to do with Chuck. They read in part, quote, "Men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken." End quote. Ruth eventually just slammed the Bible closed because she had no idea what it meant, and frankly, she had no idea what to think about anything anymore. And at this point, all she hoped for was that her husband was somehow still alive somewhere in the world, and that hopefully he would return soon. About 24 hours later, on June 17th, Chuck, who was actually only a few miles away from his home, sped through Tucson in his Mercury Cougar, constantly checking his rearview mirror to make sure no one was following him. Then he suddenly turned into the parking lot of a cheap motel where he had been hiding out for the last few days, and he came to a stop. Chuck was wearing his bulletproof vest over a sweat-stained dress shirt, and he was also now missing a tooth. Chuck grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat, and he unholstered his .357 Magnum. Then he climbed out of his car, slammed the door, and sprinted with the briefcase and gun in hand toward the motel. Once safely inside his room, Chuck locked the door and placed the gun as well as the briefcase down on the bed. And then he opened the briefcase, and what he saw made him smile. He was looking at $60,000 in cash stacked neatly inside. For reference, $60,000 then would be worth about $300,000 in today's dollars. Chuck had put this money in the briefcase himself, but he was paranoid that somehow it would just disappear, and so looking at it calmed him down. Then Chuck closed the briefcase and pulled a black marker along with a $2 bill out of his pocket. $2 bills are the rarest form of cash produced in the United States. Then he placed that $2 bill on the bedside table and started writing on it with the marker. After he was done, he pulled his pants down and pinned the now marked up $2 bill to his underwear. Then he pulled his pants back up, he grabbed his gun, he grabbed the briefcase, and then he turned around and rushed right back outside to his car. Once he got there, he threw the briefcase into the passenger seat and then jumped into the driver's seat where he turned the ignition and peeled out of the parking lot. He sped west for a while and eventually pulled onto a dark desert road. After getting about 30 miles outside of Tucson, he swerved off the road into a secluded desert clearing where he stopped the car and cut the ignition. At this point, Chuck reached into his pocket and took out a wadded-up tissue, and he unwrapped it. Inside was the tooth he was missing. He stared at it for a second before balling it back up and then placing it in the backseat of his car. Then he checked to make sure his gun was still in his holster, and it was, and then after taking a deep breath, he grabbed the briefcase from the passenger seat and stepped outside of his car into the desert. The next day, June 18th, Ruth was in her living room when there was a knock at the front door. When Ruth opened it, an officer from the Pima County Sheriff's Department was standing there. For a second, Ruth felt a flood of relief. Maybe they were here to say they found Chuck and that he was okay. But moments later, when she was sitting on her couch in the living room, the officer told her that he had some bad news. 2 people driving down a highway in the desert to the west of the city had just discovered Chuck's body. The officer told Ruth that Chuck was lying out in the sand and appeared to have committed suicide. The officer suggested that perhaps Chuck had had some sort of mental breakdown, as his appearance was totally bizarre. He was missing a tooth that looked like it had recently been knocked out or pulled out. He was armed with this powerful firearm, and in his pocket was a $2 bill with incomprehensible messages written all over it. Ruth was absolutely devastated, even though she wasn't really shocked at the news. After a moment, when she had composed herself, she asked the officer if any of the messages on the $2 bill might be like a suicide note for her and the kids, explaining what had happened. And the officer just shook his head and said, no, there was no communication left behind besides on this $2 bill, and that was definitely not intended for you. After hearing this, Ruth finally just broke down and sobbed. She felt a horrible sense of guilt and regret about how she had handled Chuck's behavior over the last few months. She wished she had just totally ignored his request and gone to the police right away, or at least told someone about what was going on with him, because maybe then he'd be alive. But underneath her own feelings of guilt, Ruth also started to feel kind of angry with Chuck. Why hadn't he left behind some sort of note for her or the kids? Why would he take his life without at least explaining the situation to his own family who he loved? It made no sense. In the aftermath of Chuck's death, Ruth planned his funeral and focused all of her energy on making sure her girls were okay. She didn't want to believe that Chuck had killed himself, but the police department was adamant that that was what happened. And in time, Ruth and her kids began to accept that that was the reality. Fast forward to sometime in the late 1980s, roughly a decade after Chuck had died, and Ruth was home in the same house she had shared with Chuck when her phone rang. And when she heard what the man on the other end of the line had to say, her heart suddenly started to beat rapidly and she had to grab a chair to sit down. The caller's name was Don Devereaux, and he was an investigative reporter. And he told Ruth that he wanted to meet with her because he had something very important to tell her. Something he said she might not believe. It was about her late husband, Chuck. When the pair met at a local coffee shop, Dawn asked Ruth if she was really ready to hear everything, even if it was painful. And Ruth, even though her voice trembled, didn't hesitate. She said, "Yes, tell me." Based on Dawn's independent investigation following Chuck's death, this is a reconstruction of what Dawn believes could have happened on the night of June 17, 1977, the night that police said Chuck committed suicide. According to Dawn's theory, on the night of June 17th, Chuck drove out into the desert, he parked, he stepped out of his car carrying that briefcase that contained $60,000 in cash, he had his .357 Magnum pistol on his hip, and more guns in the car, and as he's standing out there, he sees up ahead headlights suddenly appear a few yards away from where Chuck was standing, and once that car came to a stop, a man stepped out who was wearing a dark suit. Chuck took a step towards this man, but the man quickly pulled out a gun and aimed it at Chuck, and so Chuck froze. The man told him to show him the cash, at which point Chuck did open up the briefcase. The man told Chuck to put the briefcase on the ground and turn around, and so Chuck followed the instructions, believing that in just a few minutes, the nightmare he had been living through would finally be over, and he would be able to drive back home to Ruth and his girls, and then they could move far away and put all of this behind them forever. After turning away from the man in the suit, Chuck stood there listening to the sound of this man walking closer and closer to him. And then this man's footsteps stopped right behind him, and suddenly Chuck would have felt a jerk by his hip, and he would have realized the man in the suit had grabbed Chuck's gun from its holster. And then before Chuck could do anything, this man had fired Chuck's gun into the back of Chuck's head, killing him instantly. Then the man in the suit wiped the gun of his fingerprints and positioned it near Chuck's hand to make it look like Chuck had shot himself. Then the man in the suit grabbed the briefcase, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving Chuck's body where he fell. Dawn wasn't sure if Chuck actually worked undercover for the U.S. Treasury Department, but Dawn did think that Chuck had somehow gotten involved with organized crime, most likely through his escrow business. Dawn believed that Chuck had been conducting illegal real estate deals that allowed criminals to smuggle drugs into Arizona from Mexico, and then Chuck was then laundering their drug money for them. Money laundering is concealing money gained illegally by transferring it through international banks into legitimate businesses like real estate. Dawn knew that weeks before Chuck's supposed kidnapping, the state of Arizona and the Arizona Attorney General's office had named Chuck as a witness in a trial that involved an organized crime boss. Dawn believed that that crime boss had hired a hitman to kill Chuck to keep him from testifying against him. And most likely, according to Dawn, Chuck had figured this out. And so that was why Chuck had begun carrying a weapon around and wearing a bulletproof vest all the time. But Don said he had learned from a friend of Chuck's, a woman known simply as, quote, Green Eyes, that the hitman had told Chuck he would call off the hit if Chuck just paid him, the hitman, $60,000 in cash. So Don believes that Chuck jumped at this opportunity to save himself, and it was likely the reason he left his house on June 7th, 1977, to go get the money and pay off the hitman. However, the meeting with the hitman didn't happen until June 17th, 10 days later. And obviously the hitman did not keep his promise. The hitman was very likely the man in the suit, and he just took the money from Chuck and killed him anyways. And so as for what Chuck was doing and why he was avoiding his wife and kids and the police during those 10 days between when he left his house on June 7th and disappeared and when he was killed on June 17th, Don, and everybody else for that matter, has no idea. And that was far from the only unanswered question in this case. The friend of Chuck's, known as Green Eyes, admitted to being the woman who called Ruth on June 16th, the night before Chuck died, to mention that Bible verse from Ecclesiastes. However, she never specified what it meant. Don believed that the Bible verse could be a code that Chuck had asked Green Eyes to pass along to Ruth and his family, maybe to signify that he was okay. But if the Bible verse was really a code, why hadn't Chuck given Ruth a way to crack it? Because she had no idea what it meant. Again, Don doesn't know, and really no one knows why. As for the tooth that was found in the back seat of Chuck's car out in the desert, Don said that had a very specific meaning. At the time Chuck died, there were rumors that some mobsters removed their victims' teeth to keep them from being identified by police after they were killed. So Don believed that maybe Chuck removed one of his teeth in advance of his meeting with this hitman and then left the tooth in his car to ensure officials would be able to still identify him if the worst were to happen during this meeting. As for the $2 bill that was found with the strange messages written all over it, Don said these messages were not nonsense at all. They were Chuck's attempt to tell the world what had happened to him. Don had not completely solved the riddle, but he believed he was close. On the front of the $2 bill, Chuck had written 7 Spanish last names. On the back, where the $2 bill shows a picture of the founding fathers who had signed the Declaration of Independence, Chuck had labeled each of the men in the picture with the numbers 1 through 7. He had also scrawled a crude map of a route from Tucson to the Mexican border. Don told Ruth that he believed the names and the map were Chuck's way of pointing to specific smugglers moving drugs between Mexico and Tucson. There was one last clue on the $2 bill. It was the phrase Ecclesiastes 12. This was the same section of the Bible that Green Eyes had mentioned to Ruth on the phone on June 16th. And so it supported the theory that the Bible verse could be some kind of code, but of course that code is still not cracked. After Don finished telling Ruth his theory about Chuck, Ruth felt a sense of relief that maybe finally she had gotten the explanation she had so desperately wanted for all these years. But at the same time, it was clear that Don's theory was just that, a theory. And there are many more compelling theories about Chuck, some that include him actually being an undercover agent for the government, others that paint him as a man who simply lost his mind. But as of today, all we know for sure is that Chuck was found shot to death out in the desert, and officially, his death is still listed as a suicide.
Simply put, a goth is someone who finds beauty in things that most other people consider to be pretty dark. But most Americans tend to associate the term goth with the teenagers of the late 90s and early 2000s that wore all black and wore heavy black boots and would hang out in cemeteries. And while that representation of goth culture is, of course, limited, it is a good representation of the two protagonists in today's story, best friends Rachel and Molly. In the 1990s, Rachel and Molly were full-blown goths. They had black hair, black makeup, black clothes, they had the black heavy combat boots, and at one point they and their other goth friends started hanging out in a cemetery to be kind of ironic and funny, like, look at us, we're goth, we hang out in cemeteries. And then they actually enjoyed it and began hanging out in a cemetery like every weekend. One Friday night, Molly calls Rachel to go hang out in the cemetery. And as it happened, Rachel was just sitting at home and she was bored out of her mind. And so the call came at a perfect time. And so Rachel's like, yeah, I'd love to go. So she flies downstairs and she sits on her front step and she's waiting for Molly to show up. And eventually Molly's car rolls down the street, and Rachel immediately recognizes that Molly is the only one in the car. And Rachel, whenever she would go to the cemetery at night with Molly, they were always there with a group of at least 4 people. Even though they liked hanging out in the cemetery, they did recognize that it was a little bit creepy at night to be out there, and so they liked kind of rolling in a fairly big group. And so Rachel hops in the car, and her first question to Molly is, where is everybody? Are they meeting us there? And Molly said, oh no, everybody else is either working or they're kind of hungover from the party from last night, so it's just us two. I hope that's okay. And at the time, Rachel actually in her head was like, no, I don't really want to do this anymore. But she was like, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we'll just go. Just the 2 of us. It'll be fine. Molly takes off from Rachel's house, and she makes the familiar kind of winding commute to the front gate of this enormous cemetery that sits right in the center of town. They drive underneath this massive wrought iron gate that looks very medieval, very foreboding. It looks like it's out of a cheesy horror movie, this like cliche entrance to a cemetery. And so they go through there, and they're on this road that stretches all the way down through the cemetery and basically splits it in 2. On the left side, as you're driving in, was an area closest to town, and also it butted up against a major public university. And then on this side of the cemetery, you had a bunch of residential houses that butted up against the side of the cemetery. And where Molly and Rachel and their crew liked to go was on the right side, all the way back in the corner, because there was a section that was kind of situated between these 2 hills, where not only were they obscured from the cemetery road and the main road once they were down in this little depression, there was also no houses that happened to look over that spot. So it was kind of like the hidden section of the cemetery, and there was also this big boulder that people sat on and a big tree you could lean up against. So that was their spot. So Molly drives in the gates, she heads down that road, and she turns right onto a dead-end road. She takes that down about a couple hundred meters till it dead ends, and they park. And then the girls get out of the car, they light up cigarettes, and they walk down this hill that's just beyond where this dead end comes to an end. And so they walk down this hill, and it brings them to this clearing where this big rock and tree is. Rachel hops up on the rock, and she turns around, so she's facing back up the hill they just walked down, and Molly is right next to her on her right, leaning up against the tree. And for the next hour or so, they just crushed cigarettes and talked about their various boyfriend drama and life drama and whatever else they wanted to talk about. After a while, the girls started to smell a bonfire, and from where they were sitting, they could see a hill in front of them, and there was actually another hill over here, and so their view is pretty obscured out of this little valley they're in, so they can't see any fires anywhere. And so they assumed that what they're smelling was a fire coming from the other side of the cemetery, because there's that huge university over there, and they knew sometimes the college kids would come onto the cemetery and they would light fires over there, and inevitably the police would get called and they would break up the fire because you're not allowed to have a fire on the cemetery. And whenever they did that, the police would actually make rounds around the entire cemetery, and historically, basically, if you were there hanging out, they would tell you to leave. And so they think, okay, this is probably a good time to leave, because probably in the next 30 minutes to an hour, the police are going to be here. They're going to come over here, see our car, and they're going to ask us what we're doing, and we're going to have to leave. So let's just leave now. So Rachel hops off the rock, and the 2 of them begin meandering their way back up the hill towards the car. When they get about halfway up the hill, they notice to their right something bright. Now, because they were higher up, they could actually see over the hill to their right, and what they were seeing was the top of a bonfire. So the girls take a couple more steps up the hill to gain some elevation to hopefully be able to see better down into where this fire is. But even when they're up almost at the top of the hill, that fire is too far down on the other side of that hill that they can't see any people, and they can't really tell how big the fire is. They're just basically seeing the top flickers of it. Even though they don't know anything about the people over there at this fire, what they do know is when they showed up, there was no fire over there. They would have recognized it. So whoever's over there had to have shown up and built this fire while Rachel and Molly were down at the rock and tree, which means there's a pretty good chance they didn't see Rachel and Molly. This is a pretty private area. Their car was parked a little bit off to the side of the trail. And so Molly picks up on this, and she says to Rachel, hey, let's sneak back down and walk up their hill and look down and see who's here. I bet it's a bunch of college kids. It'll be funny to see what they're doing. But Rachel had a weird feeling about it. She's thinking to herself, if this is college kids, why would they have their bonfire this far away from campus? I mean, this is literally the farthest point away from the side of the cemetery that's close to their campus. If they're having a party over here, there's a good chance that anybody going to it is going to need to drive. And that just doesn't make sense if you can just walk to the other side of the campus and have a bonfire over there. And so Rachel is logically deducing that this is probably not college kids. But who else is having a bonfire in the secret section of the cemetery in the middle of the night? And Rachel's thinking that now if the police come here, they're definitely going to see us because we're so close to this bonfire. And so it's probably not a good idea to stick around much longer. But despite Rachel's hesitations, she is intrigued and she does want to see what's going on over there. So the two girls walk down the hill, they make it down to the rock and the tree, and they turn left and they begin walking up this other hill, the hill that's going to bring them up to this fire. And so they only get a few steps up this hill when they are suddenly hit with this disgusting, putrid smell that just encompasses them and it makes them gag, and they're covering their mouth and their nose. And Rachel exclaims, "Oh my God, what is that?" And then as soon as she says it, she realizes she was really loud. And they both freeze, wondering if the people on the other side of the hill have heard them. And after a little bit of silence, Molly's like, "You want to keep going?" And Rachel's like, "No, we gotta go." Between the horrible smell that's obviously coming from this weird fire and the fact that Rachel basically just gave them away. And so for all we know, these people on the other side of this hill have heard us and now they're waiting for us to come over the edge, and it's gonna be really awkward if we suddenly crash their bonfire. Rachel, she's thinking about these things, and so she's like, "Let's go, we gotta go." Molly's disappointed, but she gets it, and the two girls turn around and begin walking back. And so they walk past the tree and the rock on their left, they turn right, and they're about to walk up the hill that's going to bring them to their car when Rachel just turns around to look at the hill towards the fire where they were headed before. And standing at the top of that hill is a man just looking down at them. And the fire is illuminating him from behind, and they can clearly tell it's a man standing there looking at them. And immediately the girls felt really uncomfortable. It was almost like they had just been caught spying, even though they didn't actually get caught spying. It was what they were going to go do. And so they felt like they had almost been caught red-handed. And so Molly and Rachel just turn and begin walking up the hill, kind of with their heads down. They just felt kind of awkward. And so they move a few more steps up this hill, and Rachel looks again at where this guy was standing, and he's now gone. And Rachel's relieved, but then she realizes he's gone because he's walking, power walking, down the hill towards them. And Rachel gasps, and she grabs Molly and pushes her and says, "Go, go, 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 go." And they start running up the hill, and Rachel looks around, and now this guy is running towards them. He's down now at the rock and the tree. He's gaining on them. They sprint up over the top, they run to Molly's car, and Molly's fumbling with her keys to get the car open, and Rachel's yelling, "Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up." Finally, she gets it open, and they both jump inside. Rachel locks the car doors, and as Molly is turning the key over, Rachel's looking out the back, and she's waiting to see this guy, and sure enough, as they pull off, she sees his head come up over the ridgeline, just enough that he can clearly see them leaving, and then he ducks back down and he disappears. And the two of them speed down the road, they make a left onto that main drive, and they speed out of the cemetery. For the first few minutes of their drive, neither of them say anything. This was just a very traumatic experience, and it was also very confusing because they thought they were going over to spy on college kids having a bonfire, and then they're hit with that horrible smell. Like, what was that horrible smell? And then they leave, and there's this guy who did not look like he was a college kid. He looked like he was probably in his 40s, and then he's chasing them. Like, what was that? And when they did start talking about it, they couldn't really come to any sort of rational conclusion of what had just happened. And so they were both very spooked, and they decide, let's just go home and talk about this tomorrow. And so Molly drops Rachel off at her house, and Molly goes home, and both girls go to bed. The next morning, Rachel gets up and she heads down to the kitchen where her mom is already there having her morning coffee. And Rachel sits down and, she's not a big talker. She's not about to start by saying, "Hey, guess what happened to me last night at the cemetery?" Instead, she just sits there, and for a little bit, her mom just kind of rambles about work and what she's doing that day. And then all of a sudden, her mom, it's like she has this epiphany. And she goes, Rachel, did you hear what happened last night?" And Rachel's like, "No, what?" And her mom's like, "Someone I work with. I don't know her personally, but she works in the same building as me. She got kidnapped from the parking garage where I parked my car. I have seen her park her car in this lot, and she got kidnapped." And Rachel's like, "Oh my God, really? Like, what happened to her? Did they find her?" And her mom was like, "Yeah, but it was too late. The person who had kidnapped her had killed her and then tried to dispose of her body at the cemetery by burning her in a bonfire." Rachel suddenly felt sick because now she knew what was happening last night, and she knows what that smell was. Rachel immediately pours her heart out about everything that happened the night before, and her mom is totally horrified, but she's in particular horrified that they clearly had been there when the killer had arrived and set up shop and began burning this body. They were just literally 50 meters away the whole time. And so her mom tells her, you and Molly have to go to the police station and make a statement. They have not caught this person yet. You've seen this person, you gotta tell them. And so Rachel calls Molly and breaks the news about what was actually happening the night before and who was actually chasing them to their car, and says, we have to go to the police station. And so they agree, they go down to the police station and they tell them what happened, but they didn't get a great look at him. They could only say that he was maybe in his 40s and maybe average height. And so the police wrote it all down, but they basically said, look, if you can think of more details, we would love to hear those, because this isn't really enough to go on. And so the girls go back home and they're thinking to themselves, did he see us? Does he know that we saw him? Do you think he knows that we know he's a killer now? And so they're freaking out. But luckily, within 48 hours, the police actually caught this guy because he was driving around in the murder victim's car and someone spotted him. They pulled him over and he confessed. And so he went to jail. Needless to say, Rachel and Molly thanked their lucky stars that when they started ascending that hill and they were hit with that smell, that Rachel said, let's not go any farther. Let's leave. Because had they continued and gone to the other side, they could have wound up in the bonfire too. Our next story is called The Raptor. In June of 2015, 45-year-old James Young landed his dream job. For the last several years, James had been a 5th grade teacher in East Canton, Ohio, teaching special education. And while he loved his job and he loved the kids he worked with, he had always had his eye on becoming a guidance counselor for high school students. In 1988, James had actually graduated from East Canton, Ohio High School, and ever since his graduation, he had wanted to come back to the school and help the next generation of East Canton students prepare for their lives as adults, and a guidance counselor was designed to do just that. James had applied for the job before, but every time he applied, they would tell him that while he was qualified, there just wasn't a spot open for him. However, at the end of that school year, he was told a guidance counselor spot had opened up at the high school and the job was his if he wanted it. And so, of course, James said, yes, I'll take the job. And immediately he told his mother about this amazing news. And his mother, who lived only a block away from him in East Canton, Ohio, would say that her son was so ecstatic about the job that normally when summer break was coming up, he would really look forward to that time off from school. But now that he had this new job to look forward to, he was already anxious for the summer to be over. James was a single man, but he was not lonely. He had a number of very close, lifelong friends that he would spend virtually all of his off time with. And that summer, he did just that. He went out with his friends, they explored all of Ohio and outside surrounding areas, they spent a lot of time outside, and they enjoyed each other's company. Towards the end of the summer, James and his friends knew it was time to schedule their annual trip to Cedar Point. Cedar Point is an amusement park about 2 hours northwest of East Canton, Ohio. It's situated right on the shores of Lake Erie, and it's known for its incredible roller coasters, of which they had 17, making them the park with the second most roller coasters in the world. Every summer since James could remember, he and his very close friends would make a trip out to Cedar Point, usually at the end of the summer to kind of cap off their vacation. After looking at their calendar, they decided that the best day to go would be Thursday, August 13th. This would give the group of friends one more fun thing to do before the following week James started his new job. So on the morning of that Thursday, the friends piled into a car and they made the 2-hour commute up to Cedar Point. And as soon as they got there, they went inside, they grabbed a map, and they began systematically hitting as many rides as they possibly could. And so by 4:30 p.m., they were totally exhausted. They'd been on virtually every ride. And so they were about to call it a day when James and his friends decide, hey, let's go on one more ride before we pack it in. And so they pull out their map and they're looking, and they realize they haven't gone on one of their favorite rides. It was called the Raptor. The Raptor was not Cedar Point's biggest roller coaster, but it was their fastest. It would reach a top speed of 57 miles per hour. Passengers are seated 4 across with their feet dangling below them in these suspended chairs with the big harness that comes down. And then once the ride starts, they're brought slowly up this 137-foot hill. And then at the top, they pause before being dropped down into this nearly 4,000-foot long track that spins them upside down 6 different times.
So James and his friends, they closed up their map and they ran their way over to the Raptor. They got in line, and by 4:50 p.m., they had made it to the front of the line. They got into their seats, their harness came down, and then the ride started. And they were pulled up to the top of the hill. They paused, and then they were launched down the track. And for 2 minutes, they zipped and zagged and looped-de-looped all through this track. And then it was just suddenly over. And the friends had a great time on the ride. Except James realized about halfway through the ride, when they were upside down, his phone and wallet had come out of his pockets, and he actually saw them fall down towards the ground. And although he didn't see exactly where they landed, he had a pretty good idea of where they were. And so after they got off the ride, the friends were kind of talking about how much fun it was. And James said to them, "Hey, I lost my cell phone and wallet. Will you guys come with me while I go look for them?" And so the friends agreed. They left the Raptor station and they walked down the paved path until they were in front of this fence that said no trespassing. And so James gets up to the fence and he's looking inside of this fenced-in area, and he sees right in the middle of this restricted area is his phone and his wallet. And before James's friends could tell him not to do this, he had climbed over the fence and entered into this restricted area. He ran over to his phone and his wallet, he picked it up, and then when he stood back up again, the next wave of Raptor riders came blazing through the area, and the underside, the steel underside of the ride, hit James right in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. It threw him forward, he landed on his face, and immediately the park officials saw this happen. They stopped the ride, but the riders on board the Raptor, they didn't know what was going on. And so they're stopped on the ride, they're looking down and they hear people screaming, and they look down and they see there's this man, James, lying face down on the ground with blood pooling around his head. The fence James had climbed over was there specifically to keep visitors from getting too close to this one low point in the Raptor ride where the ride can come through and it can hit you. And so medical workers, they rush over, they hop over the fence, they get to James, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. That day, Cedar Point was put under investigation for James's death, but after reviewing the footage and talking to witnesses, the investigation was closed and they determined that the park was not at fault. James, despite being a very intelligent and sensible man, had a brief lapse in judgment, and it unfortunately cost him his life. Today, Cedar Point is still open for business, and the Raptor ride is still operational. The next and final story of today's episode is called Siren. On the morning of Monday, February 6th, 2017, a group of 7 friends who were all college-aged and living in New Zealand began packing up their cars and getting ready to drive back to Auckland, the biggest city in New Zealand. The night before, the group had been out on Lake Tikitapu for a big concert called Flocella, where audience members would listen to the music while floating around on big blow-up rafts and floats. After the concert had ended, the group of friends had left the lake and headed to a nearby relative's house where they had a quiet after-party with a couple of drinks, and then everyone went to bed a little bit after midnight. This morning, the group had gotten up early because they wanted to get on the road as soon as possible to try to beat the holiday traffic that was sure to crop up that day on the way back to Auckland. February 6th is a big national holiday in New Zealand. It's called Waitangi Day, and it's to commemorate the initial signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, which is considered to be the founding document of the country. But right as the 7 friends had finished packing up their 3 cars and were getting ready to begin their 3-hour drive north to Auckland, one of the friends, a 21-year-old named Rachel DeJong, suggested they take a quick detour before they head back home. Rachel, along with another girl in this group of friends named Maddie, had several months earlier discovered this secret swimming spot that was located only about 15 minutes away from where they were now, and it happened to be on the way back to Auckland. This swimming spot was this beautiful green-blue pool of fairly deep water that was located in the middle of a forest. This pool was actually a part of the Waikato River. However, this stretch of the river where the pool was either very shallow or dry most of the time. So as a result, this pool actually looked like a standalone body of water. While there was no official trail that led through the forest to this pool of water, there was an unofficial trail. It was basically a dirt trail that cut through the woods that had formed over the years of locals tromping their way to this pool of water. After hearing Rachel's suggestion, the group of friends all agreed that this sounded like a great idea. And so the group piled into their 3 cars, and then by around 11:40 a.m., Rachel and Maddie had directed the convoy all the way to the start of this unofficial dirt trail, which was located right on the side of a winding main road. After pulling their cars safely off to the side of the road, the group got out, and then Rachel and Maddie led them to the start of this trail, and they began walking through the forest. 15 minutes later, at 11:55 a.m., the group was getting very close to the water because the trees up ahead were starting to thin out. But also at 11:55 a.m., the group suddenly stopped because from somewhere out in the forest, way off in front of them, came this loud, shrill siren sound. And it went on for nearly 20 or 30 seconds, and then it just came to a stop. And the group kind of looked around at each other. No one knew what to make of the siren, and so eventually they just kind of shrugged it off and kept on walking. Within a minute of that siren sound coming to an end, the group had made it to the end of this unofficial dirt track, which placed them at the edge of this beautiful overlook down to the pool they were going to swim in. And so they began one by one climbing down the rocks in front of them, where there were some ropes that had been put up to help people climb down to the water. And so after they got down to the water, all of them stripped down to their bathing suits, they jumped into the pool, and they began swimming out towards the center of the pool, where there were these 2 big rocks that jutted up out of the water, almost like miniature islands. And so Rachel and the other women, so 5 of them, they climbed onto one of the rocks, and the 2 men who were part of this group climbed onto the other rock. And so they got up onto these rocks and they're looking around, taking in the sights, and then at 11:58 a.m., another siren blasts across the forest. It's the same sound as the one they heard 3 minutes earlier when they were on the dirt track. And so once again, all 7 of them are kind of looking at each other wondering, what is this siren about? But after the 20 or 30 second long siren came to an end, they glanced around them and there was no sign of any danger. There was no sign of really anything happening at all. It was just this beautiful, peaceful seeming oasis. And so before long, they had forgotten about the siren again, and Rachel had gotten out her camera and she was taking pictures, and others were taking pictures as well. And then 2 minutes later, at 12 p.m., the siren sounded for a 3rd time. Now, at this point, the group has heard the siren 2 other times. And even though the sound of the siren was kind of jarring because it was so high-pitched and shrill and really cut into their ears, this time, because they've heard it 2 other times and nothing happened, they all pretty much immediately wrote it off. So the siren's sounding for the 3rd time, and the group is not really paying attention. But when the siren finally stops this 3rd time, something very different began to happen, and the group immediately noticed it. When the 3rd siren came to a stop, the friends started to hear a new sound, and it was coming from the same direction the siren had been coming from, which in effect was upstream. Even though this river was basically dry, they could turn and look uphill, and they could clearly see where the river would go if it was full. And so the friends turn and look upstream, and they're listening to this really loud kind of smashing sound that's coming from that direction, and they're exchanging curious looks at each other, trying to figure out what that sound could be, and then all of a sudden, they see it. A white wall of water comes crashing around the corner and began barreling straight down the riverbed towards them. By the time the friends had even processed what they were seeing, the water had reached the pool they were in, and it was flooding the pool so quickly, they could literally see this huge pool rising. Its water levels were going up and up and up all around them. And so as the rocks they're standing on began to slowly submerge under all this rising water, the group collectively decided that this can't go on for very long. Whatever this is, it's gonna stop, so just stay put, stay on these rocks, we're gonna be okay. However, within seconds, the rocks they were on were completely submerged, and the water was still tumbling down the hill towards their pool, and then spilling out over the other side down the other end of the riverbed. And they're thinking to themselves, if we don't get off these rocks soon, we're gonna get swept downstream with this water. And so the 2 men who were on their own rock, they leapt to a rocky outcropping that was slightly higher up and was connected back up to the forest. And so this rocky outcropping represented safety. And so once they were up there, they turned around and they yelled to the 5 women still stranded on their rock to try to swim over to them, and the guys would grab them and pull them to safety. But by this point, the girls are looking around, the water's up to their knees, and it's rushing past them. They can barely keep their balance. They know if they attempt to swim in this water, they're gonna immediately be taken downstream with it. And so the group very quickly decides their only choice is for the women to literally jump and grab the men who have their arms outstretched for them. And so Rachel DeJong, she was the first one to try this. She leaps off the rock, she grabs the guy's arms, and she gets pulled to safety. And then she turns around, and she and the other two men continue to get the women to jump off the rock to them. And at first, it's going fairly well until they get down to the second to last woman who leaps. She grabs one of the guy's arms, and then both of them lose their footing, and the guy and the woman, they both get swept away downstream. They're gone. Rachel stays calm, and she moves to the position where the guy had been who just got swept away, and she takes out her GoPro camera selfie stick, and she extends it out to the last woman who's out on the rock. Her name is Alice. And she tells Alice, jump and grab the selfie stick. And so Alice, who's almost completely submerged in water now, makes this frantic jump to grab onto the selfie stick. She grabs it for a second, but then loses her grip, and she begins being swept away. And Rachel, who at this point was completely safe, immediately jumped into the rapids after Alice. She grabbed Alice, she attempted to turn around and grab the rock to stop them, but she couldn't get a grip. And she and Alice were also swept downstream out of view. 2 weeks before Rachel, Maddie, Alice, and the others had gone to this secret swimming spot, a warning sign, like a physical warning sign that warned people not to go near this river, don't go near this pool, was stolen. And that warning sign was normally placed at the very beginning of that unofficial dirt track that the 7 friends took to get to the pool. Meaning, when the 7 friends got out of their cars and began hiking into the forest to go to this pool, they would not have understood the danger of where they were going. Now, it is true that Rachel and Maddie had previously discovered this swim spot several months earlier. However, it seems like they had just learned that this swim spot existed and how to get to it. It did not seem like they had literally walked this trail and gotten to the pool, and so very likely they would not have known about the dangers this place posed. The pool of water they were swimming in was not actually dangerous itself. It was only dangerous because the pool was located in the middle of a spill zone. About 650 feet upstream of the pool they were swimming in is a dam, and 3 to 4 times a day, they open their gates, releasing 20,000 gallons of water per second down this mostly dry riverbed, and the water comes careening across that pool all the way to the bottom. The gates stay open for about 15 minutes, and the only reason this is done is for the spectacle of it. It's to show tourists what this riverbed looked like before the dam was built. And what this riverbed looked like before the dam was built was a raging rapid. On February 6th, 2017, the dam was set to spill at 12 p.m. So those sirens the friends heard at 11:55, 11:58, and then 12 were all warnings that a spill was about to occur. But of course, the 7 friends had no idea. After the 12 p.m. spill had finally ended, the 3 friends who had made it to the rocky outcropping and had not been swept away by the current went looking for the 4 other friends who had been swept away, and they would find them. 3 had miraculously survived, but 1 had not. The sole fatality was 21-year-old Rachel DeJong, whose idea it was to come and swim at this spot in the first place. Rachel also was the woman who had left safety and jumped back into the rapids to attempt to save her friend Alice. Today, there are many more warning signs and fences that have been put up around the Waikato River to prevent people from getting too close, because the dam still, despite the fatality, spills several times a day. However, despite all these precautions and all the notoriety around Rachel's death, people still today sneak in and go swimming in that secret pool.
1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl wakes up because she has to go to the bathroom, and she's about to unzip her tent when she stops because she hears some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something. And so she begins to unzip the tent. And there's a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent. So the moonlight's pouring through, so she has plenty of illumination. And so she looks through this tiny hole, and she can't believe what she sees. It is a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back is to them, so she can't see that she's looking through the tent. And she's feverishly digging into the ground in front of her. The girl literally falls backwards into her tent. She's so startled by what she sees. And she lands on her boyfriend, who immediately gets up and he's like, "What's going on?" And she goes, "Shh." And she points at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent and she goes, "Look." The boy is confused, but he can tell his girlfriend is very serious, so he sits up quietly and he looks through the little opening in the door and he sees the digging woman. The boy recoils and looks at his girlfriend and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He takes a flashlight and she's telling him, "Don't do it." And he opens up the tent a little bit more and he aims his flashlight directly on this woman. And this gets her attention and she stops digging and she stands up slowly and she turns around and faces them and she's got no expression. She's not giving them any indication why she's there. She's not acting aggressive. She's not acting scared. She's just completely neutral. And she stands there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they open their tent all the way, they go outside, they kind of scan around with their flashlights and she's nowhere to be found, and they go to where she was digging, and it's just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There's no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here and maybe they'll do something about it. And so feeling pretty confident that this woman's not going to come back, they both go back into the tent, they zip it shut, they get in their sleeping bags, and they're about to go to sleep when they hear someone running towards their campsite. And they know it's this woman. They immediately unzip the tent and they look out, and now the woman's not digging anymore. She's rummaging through some of their stuff that's outside of their tent. And the way she's doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head, back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy gets out and he shines a light on her and goes, "You need to leave." And she doesn't react. She just keeps flipping through all their stuff until he gets pretty forceful and says, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stops and looks at him like, "Huh, what are you doing here?" And then she gets up, turns around, and walks away. Now the couple really doesn't know what to do because she's clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she's an animal. And they're just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time and she seemed to really get it. They both do go back in the tent, and as soon as they zip it shut, they hear her come running straight back to the site, like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time she runs back to the hole in the ground and she's just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she can. And this time they come out of their tent and they're mad and they are screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seems to kind of frighten the woman, who gets up and she looks at them like, "Why are you yelling at me?" And she runs away, and it looked almost animalistic the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl are totally shaken up at this point. It's about 1:30 in the morning and this woman just keeps coming back to their site and they don't know what to do about it. So they turn on some lanterns and they turn on their flashlights and they decide, we're just going to stay outside until the morning. That way we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they've been outside for 2 hours. They're getting cold. They're super tired. The woman's nowhere to be found. And so they finally say, "You want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone." They get back in their sleeping bags and they go to sleep. They don't hear her again. The next morning when they get up and they unzip their tent, they look outside and all of their stuff has been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep is now well over a foot deep. And they realize this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows. And as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing, and there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken but didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened, but the ranger has no idea what to make of it. He's never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just leaves that day because they're not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. In 2015, an experienced outdoorsman named Bob, along with his wife, his young daughter, and their 2 German shepherds, decided to go camping in a remote part of northern Oregon. When they arrived at the site, Bob began setting up the big family tent for everyone to sleep in, and his daughter said, "Hey, do you mind if I sleep in the spare 2-man tent that we always bring with us?" Bob and his wife deliberated for a minute, but said, "You know what, that's fine, but you gotta bring Guts." That's one of the German shepherds. Guts needs to sleep with you because he's gonna be your protection. So that night, after some s'mores around a campfire, Bob's daughter, along with Guts, retreat to their 2-man tent, and Bob, his wife, and Leah, the other dog, retreat to their tent. That night, Bob wakes up suddenly to what sounds like footsteps outside of his tent, and he looks to his side, and his wife is still in the tent with him, and so is Leah, the other dog, and he listens really closely, and he can hear his daughter is snoring, and he can hear the sound of Guts breathing. So his whole family is accounted for, but he still hears these footsteps, and they don't sound like light little scampering sounds like you might expect from a squirrel or some small critter. They sound heavy, like a big creature is roaming around their campsite. But Bob's dogs are really keyed in to protecting their family, and since Guts and Leah are not up going crazy about whatever's out there, he figures, you know what, it's gotta be an elk or something, and it's not gonna do anything to us, so Bob ultimately just goes back to sleep. The next morning, Bob gets up, and everybody's just fine. There's no sign of any intruders in their campsite, and so that only confirms to him that, yep, it was just some harmless animal kind of walking around the wilderness, because we're in a pretty remote area. That morning, they decide to go for a walk down the road that was right next to their campsite. And so they take the dogs, they start walking, and they make it a couple hundred feet down this road when all of a sudden Guts sees something or hears something and takes off sprinting down the road and turns down this little access road that branches off of the road they're on into the woods. And Bob is thinking, oh no, there's a campsite down there and this big German shepherd's gonna bound up on them and something bad's gonna happen. And so Bob, his heart's racing, he starts taking off after Guts. He goes down the access road and he finds Guts stopped right outside of a campsite. But there doesn't appear to be anybody in the campsite. But there's a tent, there's a cooler, there's a table, there's all the things you would expect at a campsite, just no people. So Bob runs up and he grabs Guts and he yells out reflexively, "Hey, I'm really sorry, he's totally harmless. I don't know what he saw. Hey, we're leaving." But then before he leaves, he realizes on the tent, there's this big scratch through it, like it's been cut open. And curiosity gets the better of him. And so he kind of walks up, keeping an eye out in case he's wrong and there are people still here. But as he gets closer, he realizes there's definitely no one here. This site is abandoned. Because he's looking around and all of their stuff has just been ransacked. There's scratch marks on everything, like animals have clearly come through here. And Bob, who is an avid outdoorsman, he knows how much some of their equipment cost. And he's thinking, why would anyone abandon this really expensive tent or this really expensive cooler? And as he's thinking about that, he turns and he sees there's a propane tank, a solid metal propane tank that has been completely flattened. But there's no tree that's fallen nearby. There's no source. There's no way that could have been flattened. So he's definitely unsettled by this, but ultimately he decides, you know what? I'm gonna take my family, go back to my campsite. I'll just call the park rangers. They can come down here and they can figure out what this is. Later that afternoon, Bob and his family are back at their campsite just a couple hundred feet away from this abandoned campsite. And at one point, his wife gets up to go use the bathroom. She walks about 70 feet away behind a tree and she squats down. And then all of a sudden, she gets up and starts running back towards camp. And Bob sees this. He turns and sees her running towards him. At the same time, Guts gets up and starts sprinting towards her. And so Bob's thinking, what the heck is going on? Bob turns to his daughter and says, "Stay right here with Leah." And Bob gets up and starts running towards his wife. And Guts, at this point, has run to his wife and past his wife. Guts has run way into the woods. And as Bob is running up to his wife, he's like, "What's going on? Why are you running? What's going on?" And she says, "I don't know. I just had this horrible feeling someone was watching me. And when I turned, I already saw Guts running towards me and it scared me. And so that's why I'm here." And he's like, "Look, go with our daughter and with Leah. I'm going to see what's going on." And so his wife leaves and Bob draws his pistol and he starts walking out towards where Guts has now stopped. Hair raised, growling, it's yapping and barking at something in front of it. And Bob's looking and he can't see anything. And finally, after not being able to figure out what the heck is going on, he just takes Guts and goes back to his campsite. When Bob got back to his campsite, he wanted to leave. And his wife wanted to leave. His daughter didn't really know what was going on, but the attitude was, we want to leave. However, it was getting late and they had a bunch of stuff they would need to pack up. And it was going to be a real ordeal trying to do that, especially without any light. So they decide, okay, we'll stay one more day and we're going to leave first thing in the morning. In Bob's head, he's thinking, okay, I heard weird footsteps outside. We have this abandoned campsite nearby that's been thrashed up in the flattened propane tank. And now my wife is running away from something, and Guts is seeing strange things in the woods. Like, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. And he decides he's going to set up a tripwire all the way around his campsite using a rope tied at about 8 inches off the ground, where along the rope would be little pieces of metal that would clang together. So if anything touched the rope, it would make the metallic clinking sound, then it would alert Bob that someone's here. And so Bob goes over to the edge of the site where there's an obvious starting point for this tripwire, and he bends down to tie the rope, and he realizes, oh my God, someone's already done this. There is another tripwire that's already been built around the outside of our campsite. It's just been cut, it's been broken. Like, it doesn't work, but it's here. Someone else who was at this campsite felt concerned enough about whatever was in the woods that they already had this idea. Bob didn't even tie his perimeter. He just drew his gun, told his family, get in the truck, and he stayed up all night protecting his family in the truck. As soon as the sun came up, they packed up and they got the heck out of there. Bob is convinced that there is something out there in the woods in northern Oregon that was walking around their campsite at night, that's scaring their dogs, that's stalking them basically and watching them from a distance. And probably whatever is out in the woods is the same thing that caused the previous group to set up their own tripwire. And it's also probably the reason the other campers at the other campsite were willing to abandon their nice equipment to get the heck out of there, because they are not messing with whatever the heck is out in those woods. In 2004, wildland firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks, this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked, and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns, and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, he knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing, and in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest, on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's gonna emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's gonna be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin, because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is going to have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving, and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her, and she's still on the branch, now turned around facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They got to fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that, and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest? And the guy kind of laughed, and he was like, you know, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from there. So besides that, I don't know. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's stories, and I will pin the best comment of the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come out to dinner with you at a very expensive restaurant, eat a ton of food, but before the bill gets there, say you're going to the bathroom and just leave the restaurant. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it.